Call of Duty Black Ops 6 marks the return of developers Raven and Treyarch, with the project 4 years in the making since Black Ops Cold War. In that time, there's been a technical upheaval of sorts. Firstly, Black Ops 6 moves to the IW9 engine, and in doing so, away from Treyarch's own customized engine used in its Black Ops line. The benefit being, it now aligns the game's technology with the most recent portfolio of Call of Duty titles, like Modern Warfare 2, 3, and most crucially, the upcoming Warzone component. Using IW9, we'll soon go on to see, on November 14th, the gameplay systems in Black Ops 6's campaign roll out to its Battle Royale mode as well, including the game's so-called Omni movement that lets players sprint and dive in all directions. For today though, my focus is purely on the state of the game's single player on every console, including last-gen machines. And it's worth delving into because Black Ops 6's campaign is one of the series' most adventurous in years. We get branching dialogue trees, large free-roaming sandbox levels, and even these stealthy Hitman-style missions which you're free to tackle in several ways. We saw flickers of these ideas in Cold War and even last year's Modern Warfare 3, but here, today, they're greatly expanded out, and it pairs nicely with Black Ops 6's more bombastic tone. Let's cut to the chase with a look at PlayStation 5 and Series X first, and it being an IW9 engine game at its core, we're in very familiar territory to Modern Warfare 3 of course. The basics are, each of these two consoles run with a 3840x2160 resolution target that dynamically adjusts down to 1920x2160. In effect, adjusting on the horizontal axis alone gives both PS5 and Series X enough GPU headroom to usually tackle Black Ops 6's most explosive missions at 60 frames per second. It must be said though, the visual standard for the game does have some glaring limits. In amongst the at times entertaining and varied mission design, you will catch rough spots. Up close there are these low-res textures, there are blocky shadows, and even a complete absence of shadows from major light sources like explosions. It's a disappointment also to find ray tracing support is absent this time around, after being a highlight of Cold War back in 2020. The fact of the matter is, Black Ops 6 is built to scale to multiple systems, including the now aging PS4 and Xbox One, but the upside is we do get 120Hz support on these current gen systems. On the framerate front, looking at 60Hz support first, both PS5 and Series X enjoy a tight 60fps a majority of the time, though there are still issues. You'll notice checkpoint hitches during play for a start, which means you'll often see a cluster of dropped frames preceding an autosave. These stutters affect every console to some extent, and while not as distracting as on last-gen consoles perhaps, they do occasionally interrupt gameplay. The second point relates to actual sub-60fps drops related to the action, which are thankfully few and far between. Again, PS5 and Series X are typically solid, but it is possible to trigger a drop to 50fps on each by igniting C4 on these targets during its open world missions. Also, in line with recent Call of Duty titles, Series X tends to drop more regularly in the campaign. In the main shootouts of Mission 2 across this marketplace, there are obviously drops into the 50s on PS5, but in switching to the Series X version, they tend to be much more aggressive and more frequent. It's a trivial point if you have a VRR display of course, but it does mean for those without VRR, you will get a smoother playthrough on PS5. Jumping over to Xbox Series S, the turnout is far less convincing at 60 frames per second. From the very first mission in Kuwait right on through to the open-ended Iraq stage, it's a more variable 50 to 60fps range with tearing at the display's top. At the very lowest, most extreme point, we're even seeing dips into the mid-40s while triggering C4 on targets. Practically speaking then, in battle there's really no way to ignore these drops, and VRR is ideally the only way to salvage a smooth experience. In terms of resolution, Series S also sticks to a similar target as in Modern Warfare 3, a 1440p target with drops to 1280x1440. Now, there are signs of the vertical axis being affected too in rare cases, but despite that, there's simply not enough flexibility here to adjust to GPU load. On the upside here though, visual settings are broadly intact from the PS5 and Series X renditions of the game, but it is a shame to see Series S falling so short of a tight 60 here. Switching over to the 120Hz mode on each console next, it's fascinating to see the peaks and troughs of each machine's performance revealed with no 60fps cap. The native resolution setup is the same as at 60Hz and all the core visual settings are identical too, except here we see PS5 and Series X run the gamut from as high as 120fps at rare points, with sharp plummets down to the 60fps line. It's highly variable, but most battles do tend to stabilize within the 70 to 90fps range as you'd expect, coupled with tearing at the top of the display. Really, and while it is a neat option to have, it's mainly those with VRR supporting displays that will benefit. The reading is often too variable otherwise for non-VRR displays, where settling for a flattened 60fps line will perhaps give a more perceptually smooth result. And checking out Series S in the same mode, we clearly fall short in matching tests compared to PS5 and Series X. On average, the frame rate lowers by 15 to 30fps on Series S overall, and again, it does have greater potential to go below the 60fps line. All of which leaves us to the last gen situation. The big question here being, is it possible for PS4 or Xbox One consoles to produce a decent enough Black Ops 6 experience here? Let's take base PS4 as an example of a last gen system compared to PS5 to see what visual settings are actually cut back. As far as image quality is concerned, PS4 targets a native 1080p, as is so usual for the series, with dynamic adjustments taking it to 960 by 1080 based on GPU load. There's an obvious drop-off in clarity compared to PS5's 4K resolve, but it does look reasonable on its own terms. Other key settings are dropped however. Most environmental textures are lowered a setting, as is skin shader quality on character faces. Shadows also take a hit, with a more dithered, noisy appearance in close-ups. In fact, as an extreme measure to hit 60 frames per second on PS4, shadow casting from characters or NPCs is at times disabled outright, notably outside this conference hall. Screen space reflections, SSR, is disabled as well, meaning glossy floors and water bodies now purely rely on static cube maps. And finally, in the open-ended Iraq mission, terrain and shadows visibly pop in, much more so than on current-gen machines. All of these limits apply to every last-gen console, from base Xbox One to PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. In fairness, the more contained, linear stages of the campaign mode hold up reasonably well, but the pop-in, the LOD transitions on geometry, and especially the slow-loading textures are all a huge drawback on all four systems. Let's return to the frame rate testing. Base PS4 here is the most popular system of its generation, and with that being the case, typically cross-gen projects use it as a kind of baseline target for optimization. Not so for Black Ops 6 though. From the very first steps of the Kuwait opener, PS4 lurches between 45 to 60 FPS. Now, there are stretches at 60, often low-key stealth segments or driving between areas. However, for Call of Duty's actual signature combat, each level progressively puts more demands on the 11-year-old system. This marketplace shootout, for one, has us between 40 to 60 FPS with screen tearing in tow, and we get a similar range for any open world combat. Sadly, this is coupled with hitches, again related to the game's checkpoint save system, but they hang for much longer on PS4. Even worse still, PS4 suffers from major streaming issues at points, notably on the hunting season mission, where moving between segments of the map triggers a spell of stuttering motion. In short, the mixture of heavy GPU side drops, checkpoint hitches, and traversal stutters makes PS4's campaign mode one to avoid this year. Looking at PS4 Pro next, the good news is much of this is improved. In terms of resolution, we're getting a target 1512p with a similar drop on the horizontal axis as with the other machines. Alas, The checkpoint hitches remain on PS4 Pro, frustratingly, but the typical frame rate in action holds to 60 frames per second much better across the board. There are key exceptions, like this shootout across the market, taking us down to the 50s at points, and likewise, while planting C4 during the open field missions. Also, interestingly, PS4 Pro is the only console that engages VSync, meaning there's no screen tearing. Of the quartet of last-gen machines, PS4 Pro is the best of a bad bunch in this sense. It's by no means perfect, and fluctuates between 50 to 60 FPS with heavy combat, but it's capable, at times, of a tighter 60 FPS experience than most. Comparatively speaking, Xbox One X runs worse overall. One X uses the same 1512p target, though gameplay often runs at a lower frame rate on average than PS4 Pro. This marketplace shootout, for example, frequently runs down to the 50 FPS line and well into the 40s. Also, in One X's case, this is coupled with more frequent traversal stutters as well. These range from small blips to almost an entire second of dropped frames, which is obviously a huge distraction during combat. Overall, Black Ops 6's last-gen performance makes it clear where the developers' priorities are. Speaking purely on the campaign mode, and if this is your attraction to the series, it's increasingly hard to recommend PS4, PS4 Pro, or Xbox One X, and that's not even to speak on the base Xbox One. As usual, Xbox One sticks to a 900p target, and as you'd expect, pushes the very worst performance of all 7 consoles. No surprises here, we're talking about a constant 40 to 45 FPS reading from the very first mission, and with drops to the mid-20s even possible in cutscenes. Of course, there's a kind of morbid curiosity to seeing how Xbox One fares at this point, and it's doubtful anyone will expect much better from vintage 2013 technology. Still, for posterity, this is how it runs. The takeaway being that Call of Duty's campaign offerings are discouragingly bad on last gen at this point, perhaps excluding the PS4 Pro. Black Ops 6 is available on Game Pass if you're still hanging dear to your Xbox One or One X and fancy giving it a go, but it's clearly a far cry from the developer's intended experience, and for that, the campaign is so much better enjoyed on current gen machines. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this analysis, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.